Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Devin Murray. I am the manager for the Engineering Services Division of Schmersal. Schmersal being a leader of manufacture of safety components and safe solutions for industrial machines. Really quick, my background is electrical engineering and business administration with a BS and MBA from Alfred University. And I do hold a functional safety engineer certificate for machinery from TUV Rhineland. I've been with the company Schmersal for 15 years and the manager for our services division for 3 years. Um, and it is my pleasure to be speaking with you today regarding Lockout Tagout. And we will discuss the OSHA requirements, try to interpret some of those requirements, and take a look at what a successful Lockout Tagout program looks like. Okay. Of course, if you have any questions at all, please use the questions field, and I'll try to get to those questions. We should have some time at the end of this presentation to get to those questions. If for any reason I can't get to your question is logged with your email address, and I'll be sure to reach out to you to answer your question. I did see one question pop up already regarding proof of participation, and we can definitely provide that to you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into what you are all here to listen to, which again is the basic overview for OSHA's lockout tagout requirements. Okay, so first I would like to focus just a few minutes on OSHA's top 10 violation list. Okay. And on this slide here, we see lockout tagout and machine guarding. And the reason that I list these here is to get a better understanding of why we are even, introducing this as a topic for the webinar, why you may have interest in this as a topic for the webinar, right? So if we look at what we show here on the table, and we start with, the year 2013, and we see lockout tagout was ranked 8th on this top 10 list. And in that year, 2013, there were 3,250 violations. That same year, machine guarding was 10th on the list with 2,852 violations. And that's what this chart is showing over the last 10 years. And we see that lockout, tagout, and machine guarding is consistently on this top 10 list. Okay. Now, the numbers that I'm showing here are taken from the National Security Council. They tend to publish the OSHA list a little early. So these aren't the official numbers. So with some lists, you may see, machine guarding, maybe one up or down on the list for that year, but it's still within the top 10. Same thing with lockout tagout. Okay. What I want to highlight looking at this list here is we see that over the past 4 years, so since 2020, lockout, tagout, and machine guarding have remained, sixth and 10th on this list, respectively. Unfortunately, we also see that the violations are on the rise again over the past 3 years, right? For both lockout, tagout, and machine guarding. Later on, I will show why we even mention machine guarding violations when our focus here today is lockout tagout. Okay. So lockout tagout. Lockout tagout is specifically defined by OSHA, and such as that, it is a legal obligation, right? OSHA is the law of the land. They're a governing body. If they, state it, it is law. right? So lockout tagout is a legal obligation. OSHA provides the requirements for LOTO under the Labor Title 29 of the Code of Federal Regulations, so CFR, Part 1910, Subpart J, okay, which focuses on the general environmental controls. So 29 CFR 1910.147 is the OSHA requirement for the control of hazardous energy, or lockout tagout. Okay, so throughout this whole presentation, I'll refer back to, OSHA 29 CFR 1910.147. Now we look at the purpose. All right, the purpose of lockout tagout is to reduce the likelihood of worker injuries and fatalities during servicing and maintenance operations. And if we go a little deeper in there into this requirement, what we're going to focus on today are three of the main elements to a successful lockout tagout program. The first being develop and implement procedures, and we'll talk about what those procedures are, what they look like, what are some of the requirements for those, some of the general procedures and the machine specific procedures. Right. So the first thing is develop and implement procedures revolving around lockout tagout. The next is training. Once we have a procedure in place, we then have to train, and we have to look at who should be trained to what level. And we show here on the slide here, authorized and affected. And of course, we'll go into what those two different personnels are doing with lockout tagout and what type of training we need to provide for those individuals and everyone else that may not be doing lockout tagout. They might not be using that machine, but they may just be in the area or within the company. They need to be trained as well. Again, we'll look at what type of training they may need. And when we look at lockout tagout, this is not a program that we write up and we store inside of a file cabinet. This is a program that requires annual inspection. Right. So once we develop and implement and train, this is a continuous effort to maintain this lockout tagout program. And again, we'll look into more detail of what that is. But this is the purpose. We want to make sure that we are reducing the likelihood of worker injuries and fatalities during servicing and maintenance operations. And one way to make sure that we are fulfilling this purpose is by developing implement procedures, training, and conducting those annual inspections of the lockout tagout procedures. Okay. As far as the scope, and if you're on this line, you either have a direct requirement for lockout tagout, so maybe you are an authorized employee or you're responsible for the program or whatever the case may be. You're on this line because there is some interest of lockout tagout, and as such, you've probably gone to OSHA.gov at some point to look at the scope and requirements and purpose of lockout tagout. And this is just a screenshot of the website. And taken from the website, we show here the scope, right? The scope of lockout tagout is to make sure that we are focusing on the servicing and maintenance of machines and equipment so that we are protecting employees against unexpected startup of the machine. Okay, so essentially, I have a task that is, not classified as a normal operation. And while doing this task, if the equipment was to, unexpectedly cycle or there's a release of energy, I may be exposed to hazards which may harm me. In this instance, we have to consider lockout tagout. Okay. So what we see here on the screen is, directly from OSHA. This is what they state. And what I'll try to do throughout this entire presentation is let's look at what those key points are. Let's try to interpret what they're trying to say. So we look at the scope. We're looking at the servicing and maintenance tasks to help protect the employee from an unexpected startup. Okay, and I mentioned here that this information is directly from OSHA.gov. There's also some information that I'll show at the end of the presentation as far as tools that can help you better understand and interpret the requirement. And one of those would be the Lockout Tagout Compliance Directive. So you'll also see me refer back to some of the information that's taken from the Lockout Tagout Compliance Directive, in addition to the actual 1910.147. Okay, so services, maintenance tasks, right? That's going to require lockout tagout. What's not covered? So we go deeper into the scope of the requirement. We see what's not covered from lockout tagout, and it says normal production operations are not covered. Okay, and here OSHA states that if we are looking at normal production activities, then we want to look at subpart O. Subpart O is for machinery and machine guarding. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight that machine guarding and lockout tagout violations are consistently on the top 10, looking at that first slide. Okay, OSHA says if you're not doing lockout tagout, you need to look at machine guarding. Okay, so the task that you're doing with that machine has to fall within one of those control measures. You're either locking the machine out, removing all hazardous energy, or we are relying on the guidance from subpart O to help minimize the risk of that machine. Okay, so they kind of go hand in hand, and later on we'll come back to machine guarding to see how else it relates to lockout tagout. Okay, but we're looking at, again, servicing and maintenance tasks require lockout tagout, and there's this exception: minor tool changes and adjustments and other minor servicing activities which takes place during normal production hours, they do not fall under lockout tagout, right? And then they use these words: routine, repetitive, integral activities to the machine. These are not covered under lockout tagout. So they give examples of minor tool changes, minor adjustments, and other minor servicing activities. So they give some examples of what they mean by minor tool changes and whatnot, minor services, but there's still some room for interpretation there, right? There's still some subjectivity when we're trying to understand, does this task require lockout tagout or not, right? And how do we put this into our lockout tagout program? Right? These are questions that are constantly asked, and the lockout tagout requirement from OSHA was established back in the 90s, so well over 30 years old. And again, it's a legal obligation, but there's still a lot of questions. And as you see, or as you saw, it is consistently on the top 10 violation list, right? So let's see if we can try to answer some of these questions for you. Where does that line fall? Okay. But again, what's not covered under lockout tagout? Okay, so servicing and maintenance tasks, what's take place during normal operation, are covered under lockout tagout if we have to remove a bypasser guard. Okay, so previously we said servicing and maintenance, if it's normal part of production, then we don't, that may be considered minor, right? It's repetitive routine. It may not fall under lockout tagout. But now we're saying, okay, well, let's look at this particular task. Let's look at what we're doing as far as servicing and maintenance. Are we removing a guard? Are we bypassing the safety controls that are on there? So a guard or interlock or a safety control, a safety interlock, a light curtain, safety mat, whatever the case may be, are there safety controls that we're bypassing? Is there a tunnel guard, a hard guard that we're removing? Are we placing ourselves in harm's way? Okay, if the employee is required to place any part of their body into an area of the machine or piece of equipment, right? So that point of operation, then we have to consider lockout tagout. Okay, and if we think about what this requirement is and what OSHA is trying to achieve with this, they're saying we have to make sure that the employee is safe. And I think everybody on this line can agree to that, right? We have to make sure that everyone's safe. Everyone returns back home, the way they came into work. Okay. So there's going to be some interaction with this machine. Depending on what that task is, we either have to lock out the machine of all the hazard energy to make sure that there's no unexpected startup, or we're going to rely on some other control measures to bring that machine to a safe state and still, again, make sure that there isn't unexpected startup. There isn't any unexpected startup. Okay. The question is this a normal routine operation where we can rely on, alternative control measures, or is this something that falls under the lockout tagout scope? And that's the question. So the next slide that I'm going to show you is for general guidance. Okay, there's always exceptions to the rule, so I just have to state that. But again, my goal is to see if we can interpret what OSHA is trying to tell us. So if we look at what the requirements are, minor servicing or maintenance activity and tasks, does this require lockout tagout or not? Okay, so we can look at a task and say, okay, this is a setup of maintenance task that happens outside of normal production runs. If it's outside of normal production runs, then we're going to consider lockout tagout. If those tasks are during normal production runs, then we may rely on the interlock. Okay, let's look at some examples of that outside of normal production runs or tasks that are happening during normal production runs. Okay, so let's look at cleaning a machine. If at the end of our shift, we have to clean the machine, this could be considered outside of normal production run, right? The machine has done its job for the day. We're outside of the production run. It's the end of the shift. I'm going to clean the machine. This may be a situation for lockout tagout. Because it's the end of the day, end of the shift, I'm cleaning the machine. I'm probably also removing guards to get to the guts of the machine to clean it out for the next shift. Right. So now I'm removing guards. So that's a checkbox, right? This may require lockout tagout. Similar example, if I'm cleaning something within this machine during normal production run, we may consider an interlock. So maybe I have to clean a photo eye inside of this hazardous area. Okay, cleaning that photo eye during normal production run is going to be integral to this machine function. And I may need to clean this photo eye once a shift, maybe once an hour, right? But this is part of that production run. Because of that, because of those situations, we may rely on the guard or interlock. Okay, so again, I mentioned there's always exceptions to the rules, because if we look at something like setup can be done at the beginning of the shift. Again, this is outside of a production run, right? So if I have to do a setup, and maybe I'm threading a machine. Well, I can't go into lockout tagout sometimes when I'm trying to thread certain machines because I need power, right? I need to thread material through the machine. So we look at that aspect of it. Okay, yeah, that's outside of quote unquote normal production runs. At the same time, though, I cannot do lockout tagout when I'm threading the machine, right? So there's other control measures we need to take into account. But when we look at, again, the scope and the purpose and that sentence there for services and maintenance, does this fall on the lockout tagout or not? We can look at normal production runs as stated by OSHA as some general guidance. Okay, so changing the machine tool, changing machine components, belts and valves and gauges, doing disassembly, removing guards, that's all lockout tagout. All right, if we're doing minor services, so servicing filters and minor lubricating, then all right, maybe we can rely on guard door interlocks or some other control measure that's not lockout tagout. Okay, so once we go through the tasks of our machine, we have an understanding of, yes, these particular tasks require lockout tagout. These tasks that we've identified, we can use some other alternative measures, such as an interlock or some other guarding to prevent access to these hazards. So make sure that the employee is safe. We can then add this to our lockout tagout program. But the first thing is understanding that gray area, right? Does this task require lockout tagout or not? And I think those are the main questions that I see, at least when talking with customers and doing assessments and looking at machinery. It's, yeah, in most cases we're relying on a guard or interlock to bring the machine to a safe state, but do we really need to go into a lockout tagout? Right, depending on what we're doing. And yeah, we can see most most operator tasks, which are going to be routine or repetitive, right? They're doing what the machine has been intended to do. They're loading the part to a CNC machine, for example. We know, like everybody on this line knows, I'm sure, that OSHA is not asking an operator to go into lockout tagout on a CNC machine every time they load or unload a part, right? And at the at the other end of that spectrum there, we know that if we are disassembling a machine, right, doing a complete overhaul, upgrade on the machine, yeah, we're going to go into lockout tagout. It's that gray area that has a lot of question that hopefully this kind of gives some guidance. Okay, now, and that lockout tagout program, I'm going to list everything here, and then we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so just going into some more detail about what these elements are. So in order to have a successful lockout tagout program, the first thing that we want to do is identify. So this identification, which is assigning responsibilities to the correct personnel, identifying the tasks for those personnel, identifying hazard energy sources for the machines on our site, and identifying energy isolating devices for our lockout tagout procedures and programs. Okay, so the first thing is identification, and then we look at our procedures, our operational procedures. We want to develop documented procedures for hazard energy control, provisions for hazard energy control interruptions, shift changes, group lockout tagouts, procedures for user directed lockout tagout device removal. Okay, and outside service for contractor personnel if that applies to your site. Once we have procedures developed, then the next step is implementation, right? So selecting and procuring protective materials and hardware. So what devices are we using? We'll look at some of the OSHA requirements for that. Communication and training, right? So we have to put this within our lockout tagout program. And then the last thing is program maintenance. I mentioned earlier that this is something that we just don't create and place in a control in a file cabinet, right? We have to continually monitor and update as required these procedures, this program for lockout tagout. Okay, this is also this idea of record keeping and annual inspections. This These are some of those violations that keep lockout tagout on that top 10 list. Okay. Okay, so this is the list. Let's go into some detail here. All right, so our lockout tagout program, the first thing that we need to do is identify who is responsible for establishment and maintenance of the energy control program. Okay, usually this is some EHS personnel, right? So we have to identify who's responsible for establishment and maintenance of the energy control program. Got it. Okay, this is a requirement. We also have to identify who the qualified or competent persons are who can recognize risks and complete risk assessments and training and program audits. Okay, this may be a team effort, right? So a safety lead, maintenance, someone again within the EHS department. But we have to find out who's going to be responsible for doing the risk assessments and trainings. Risk assessments. Okay, we talk about lockout tagout. Well, I also mentioned, machine guarding. So we will see in a couple of slides coming up where risk assessments come into play. Okay. We also have to identify which classification of workers are to be trained as authorized employees. And these are personnel who can perform hazardous energy controls. Okay, OSHA defines authorized employee as a person who locks out or tags out machines or equipment in order to perform servicing or maintenance on that machine or equipment. Okay, so the person is actually doing the lockout tagout procedure. It's important to note that an authorized person or an authorized employee does not only have to be maintenance personnel. Okay, I'll come back to that though in 1 second. We also have to identify affected persons who will be impacted by the hazard energy, as well as shutdown and the restart of equipment or the machine or the process. Okay, OSHA defines affected employee as an employee whose job requires them to operate or use a machine or equipment and what servicing or maintenance is being performed under lockout tagout. Okay, now as far as who's considered authorized and who's considered affected, this is not based off of job roles, right? So yes, maintenance personnel typically are going to be authorized people, right? They're doing tasks, whether it's a PM or a troubleshooting, replacing parts, whatever the case is. At some point, as a maintenance personnel, they're going to have to go into a lockout tagout state. Okay, so generally speaking, on your site, on the sites that we're at, yeah, maintenance personnel are going to be authorized. They're gonna have to go through the lockout tagout training. Okay, perfect. Operators can also be authorized if it requires them to. Okay, so I mentioned in my previous example, I'm an operator, and at the end of my shift, I have to clean the machine and I have to remove some guards. Well, in that situation, I have to put the machine into a lockout tagout state. So I may be an authorized employee, even though I'm an operator, right? So authorized and affected doesn't go by job title; it goes by tasks. So an operator can definitely be an unauthorized employee. Okay, depends on the site, depends on the tasks. Okay. Okay, the tasks. So we have to identify what the risks are, and the tasks, which would expose persons to the risk that can cause the harm. Okay, and then we have some examples here: setup and changeovers and clearing jams, machine adjustments, and maintenance. Okay, so we have to identify what those tasks are. Again, going back to the previous slides, yeah, OSHA says servicing and maintenance, but the question is, what exactly are we doing? Is this going to be minor tasks, minor servicing? Okay, so we have to identify what those tasks are. Now let's look at operational procedures. So again, 1910.147 C4I, procedures shall be developed. Okay, procedures shall be developed and documented and utilized for the control of potential hazard energy. Okay, and again, what we're looking at are tasks that are not repetitive, not routine, not integral to the operation of that machine. I told you I was going to keep saying those three words: repetitive, routine, and integral. Okay, so if they're not repetitive, not routine, not integral, lockout tagout. We have to develop procedures for this task to go into a lockout tagout state. 1910.147 C4 II. The procedure shall be clear and specific. Okay, again, these are some of the things that are ordained during OSHA violations. Not having procedures that define a scope or a purpose. Okay, and a lot of times those are just, you know, taken directly from the scope and purpose from the lockout target requirement. But we have to have a program that has this states this purpose and scope. Okay, so some of the general requirements for our procedures: a statement of attendant use. Okay, and within these procedures we have to, state how we notify employees of a shutdown and lockout tagout. We have to go through the entire process of shutting down, isolating, and locking out. We have to have procedures in place on how to handle stored energy, and then how to verify. So once you lock the machine out, we have to verify that this machine has been locked out. We have to verify that we've removed all hazardous energy. And that verification can be, a number of things, right? We can try to turn the machine on. We can actually test for voltage. So whether it's one of those or something else, but we have to verify. And that is another step that's not, that's another step that's often, I should say, missed and dinged for violations. Within those general procedures, we also have to state how to bring the machine back to a ready state. So, the reverse sequence of the lockout tagout steps. In addition to those general program procedures, we have to look at machine specific procedures. Okay, identification of the machine, the equipment, and the process. We have to list all the required energy isolating devices, the magnitude of each hazard energy. So we have, pneumatics on this machine. Well, how much psi are we dealing with? What's the voltage on this machine? What's the magnitude of the hazard energy? Okay, what are those steps to shut the machine down? What are those steps to isolate and block? What are the steps to verify? And when we do this machine specific procedures, we need to make it as clear as possible. So if we can add pictures, let's add pictures to show where on this machine those energy isolating devices are. Right? Let's clearly point out step by step by step what we need to do. Okay, we want to make it so that anyone can look at this document and follow the steps. Now, of course, right? Everyone will not be able to perform the lockout tagout, right? You have to be authorized, of course. But the goal behind this document is to make it as easy to read as possible. I want to pick the paper up. I want to see, okay, these are the points I need to lock out. These are again the magnitude of each hazardous energy. These are the devices that I need to use. This is where I need to place these devices. We want to make it as easy to read as possible. And when doing that, when creating these machine specific documentation, well, it's going to be in our best interest to have maintenance involved, right? Maintenance users are involved with this machine on an intimate level, right? They are removing guards, they're troubleshooting, they're fixing this machine, so they know the equipment, right? So we want to have their input and to make sure that yes, the steps that we are adding to this machine specific procedure actually make sense. Okay, so you want to make sure that we're using the resources of our maintenance team. Quick example, lockout tagout procedure of a compressor, right? So we have the origin date, whenever it was revised, if it was revised, the equipment number, the location, how many locks and tags do we need to perform this lockout tagout, right? Again, making it as easy as possible. The energy source and magnitude requirement from OSHA, okay? The location of the isolation. Again, let's add some pictures there. Let's add some pictures. Let's take away any confusion. Method of isolation. What are we using? What are the devices that we're using? Okay. And again, validation. We have to validate. So let's put in how we need to validate that, or how we need to validate how this source of energy has been removed. Okay. Let's make a document and let's take it to someone who is, not maintenance, not an operator. Let's take it to someone else who doesn't know anything about this machine and say, can you follow these steps? Does this make sense to you? Right. And of course, it has to make sense to maintenance, right? They're the ones that are using it, or let me go, not just maintenance, it had to make sense to the authorized employee, right? Because they're the ones that are using it, right? Again, some of these elements that are required from OSHA is also another easy way to get dinged on those inspections, right? Or another violation. These are requirements from OSHA. Okay, continuing on with operational procedures, your site may have situations that require a group lockout. Okay, and a group lockout is a procedure that, or a procedure that must, I should say, provide equal protection for multiple users working on the same de-energized system. So it can be a line, okay, a large machine where we have 2, 3, 4 maintenance personnel or authorized personnel working on the machine. Well, we need to look at a group lockout tagout. Okay, and one of the most common uh, solutions for a group lockout is what? A lockout container, a lockbox, right? And standard calls out or defines a lockbox as a container, which typically uses group lockouts that secure all the keys. So all 4 or 5 authorized personnel will place a lock on on a machine or on this lockbox, and the keys are inside, and they require that I sure can remove a lock from this lockbox because I'm done with my task. Okay. But I cannot start the machine because there are 3 or 4 other locks on this lockbox. Okay. So the requirement is that the protection has to be equivalent to an individual lockout tagout. Okay. I can place my lock on this lockbox. I'm protected because my lock is on there. I remove my lock, I still can't start the machine because those other 4 individuals have the same requirement, right? We have to protect them as well as its individual lockout tagout. Okay, and again, so the lockbox is probably the most common. Okay, and there's also procedures for a shift change. Okay, and the requirement here for this shift change is that there must be continuity and an orderly transfer of the lockout. Okay, so the oncoming shift has to accept control of this lockout tagout before the offgoing employee can release their lock. Okay, so if I'm coming on shift and there's already a machine and lockout tagout, I have to place my lock on before the individual going off shift can remove theirs. Okay, so again, if if you're one shift organization, doesn't matter. But if you are not two shift, three shift, then again, these are some of the requirements that we have to put inside of our lockout tagout program. Okay, we also have to take into account outside contractors. Okay, and removing locks. So again, if you have situations where there's multiple shifts, or and someone places their lock on a machine and they go home, right? And we need someone else to can finish the job, finish the lockout tagout, and bring the machine back to a ready state. Well, we can't because the person from the first shift left their key or left their lock on the machine. What do we do with that, right? So as far as again, what are the key elements from outside contractors? Well, both parties, the company, your company and the contractor, they both must inform each other of your lockout tagout procedures. Okay. For removing, okay, well, if that authorized employee is not within the facility, you do have to make reasonable efforts to contact them. Okay, reasonable efforts. So phone call, okay, maybe two phone calls maybe. All right. And then we have to remove their lock. All right, because we have to continue on the task for this machine. So we have to remove their lock. OSHA does require us to make sure that we tell that employee before they start their next shift. So they come in, we flag them at the front door, right? We say, hey, we removed your lock from the day before. Okay. I've been, part of organizations where if this happened and you forgot your lock on the machine, that would trigger retraining. Okay, we'll get into training in a few minutes here. Okay, but again, just some things to highlight from these requirements for your lockout tagout program. All right, now, once a program has been developed, we then have to implement it. Okay, so some things here as far as implementation, we have to select protective materials and hardware. These hardware has to be provided by the employer. And again, yeah, that makes sense, right? As a company, we're requiring you to be an authorized employee. We require you to go into lockout tagout, so we are going to provide you the locks, just like we provide you the hearing protection and eye protection, right? We're going to provide you the locks. Okay. Again, though, there's times where this may be overlooked, believe it or not. Okay. You may have a program in place where you have locks and you can assign locks, but there can be situations where an authorized employee may have lost the lock and not requested a new one. What's the procedure for that? Okay, the locks have to be durable, standardized, substantial, identifiable. Okay, the standard does not say the lock has to be red. That is not a requirement, but that's common, right? Common, the locks on the sites are all red, and that's fine. They could be blue, they could be yellow, as long as it's standardized. Okay. Um, Something right here I wanted to highlight: shall not be used for any other purpose. Okay. If we standardize these red locks for lockout tagout, we cannot then use red locks on our lockers. These logs cannot be used for any other thing than lockout tagout procedures. Okay, again, that's a easy way to get dinged by OSHA. Okay, training. The employer shall provide initial training or instructions that will ensure that all authorized and affected persons um, understand the purpose and function of the lockout tagout program. Okay, so we have to do the training, and authorized or each authorized employee have to be trained on the recognition and applicable hazards and injury sources for that machine. Okay. Each affected employee shall be instructed in the purpose and use of the energy control procedure. And then all other employees whose work or operations may be in the area where the energy control procedures are being utilized, they have to be instructed about the procedure and the reasons or the prohibition as stated within the standard of not trying to restart a machine. Okay. So everyone on the site has to have some level of training for lockout tagout. Okay. Doesn't matter if they're using the machine, that particular machine or not. They have to have some training of lockout tagout. Okay. Training or instructions must be completed for all newly hired and reassigned personnel. Okay, so we do retraining whenever there's a change in employment job assignment, whenever a new hazard is introduced due to a change in machinery or equipment or the process, wherever there's a change in the energy control procedure, or if during during the annual inspection that employee fails to demonstrate that they understand the task, then that triggers a retraining. Okay. One more note for training. Those trainings have to be documented. The name, the date, the name of the instructor. Okay. When you look at the affected training, so affected personnel, we have to look at the machine that they were tested on, right? What machine did they demonstrate this on? So everything must be documented. Again, we talk about OSHA, we're talking about legal obligation. We want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence. And one of the requirements is, yeah, they have to be documented. Okay. Program maintenance. Okay, program maintenance. So again, we want to make sure that we are continuing to monitor and update these programs as required. So 1910.147C6I, the employer shall conduct a periodic inspection of the energy control procedure at least annually to ensure that the procedure and the requirements of the standard are being followed. All right. So annual inspections, okay, at least annually. Okay. So that's going to be one of the requirements. Um, the periodic inspection shall be performed by an authorized employee other than the ones utilizing the energy control procedure being inspected. So we have to have an authorized employee inspecting another authorized employee, for example, showing their due diligence or showing they can use the machine. Okay, or just an authorized employee looking at these documents. Okay, where lockout is used for energy control, the periodic inspection shall include a review between the inspector and each authorized employee. So every authorized employee has to go through an annual demonstration that they can perform a lockout tagout procedure. Okay. The employee shall certify that the periodic inspections have been performed. So you want to document the inspections. Okay. Now we talk about maintenance, right? Maintaining this program. So the authorized personnel have to be evaluated at least annually, right? And again, if they change jobs or something in that nature, there's new hazard machine, then there's retraining for that. That's why they say at least annually. Okay, so we also have to evaluate the machine specific procedures at least annually, right? So that means we have to look at those machine specific procedures for each of those machines and go to the machine and do the lockout tagout, make sure that everything makes sense, nothing's changed, and we can still do a lockout tagout procedure. All right. That can be a lot, right? How many machines do we have on our plant? How many authorized personnel do we have in the plant? Right? This can be a tedious process. Unfortunately, it's required. Okay, so there are some things that you can do to help make this a little easier, right? One thing that I heard, which was a great idea, was part of the PM schedule, right? Add that lockout tagout procedure, or we know that during this PM that we have to go into a lockout tagout, so we'll ping it for, let's go to this machine, let's evaluate both the authorized employee doing the lockout tagout, and at the same time we're going to document to make sure that this lockout tagout procedure is still relevant. So kind of three birds with one stone. We are uh, testing the authorized employee, we're testing the procedure, and we're actually doing the PM task that we need to do. Okay, it could be a lot, right? So let's see how we can make things a little easier for us, right? Okay. Um, Alternative measures, ANSI Z2441, the standard for lockout, tagout, and alternative measures. OSHA does reference ANSI Z2441. Okay. However, it is important to note that the requirements from OSHA, right? They are the law of the land. They supersede anything. Okay. So ANSI will give us guidance, which is perfect. But we still, at the end of the day, have to make sure that we are fulfilling these legal obligations from OSHA. Okay. But what is one of the benefits here from ANSI Z2441, right? This idea of alternative measures. Now, even inside the ANSI Z2441, they state that lockout tagout shall be used. Okay. So again, legal obligation. You have to do lockout tagout unless, okay, so the burden is on us, unless that we can demonstrate that alternative measures can provide an effective protection alternative. Okay, one way to do that is by doing a risk assessment. I told you I would come back to that, right? Risk assessment. You have to do a risk assessment. You have to find out what are the hazards and risks associated with this equipment. Can we justify using alternative measures as opposed to lockout tagout? Okay, again, routine, repetitive, and integral are some of those things we may want to look for. And OSHA defines routine as the activity must be performed as part of a regular and prescribed course of procedure and be performed in accordance with established practices. Routine, okay, repetitive. The activity must be repeated regularly as part of the production process or cycle. They don't tell you how often. They don't say once a shift, once a day, 2,000 hours. Like, so there's some leeway there for us to justify what's routine and repetitive. Okay, integral. The activity must be inherent to the production process. Right, so we have to look at what those are, what those tasks are. Okay, so we have to, the employer must demonstrate that the alternative measures provide effective protection from the hazardous energy. But most importantly, okay, most importantly, this idea of alternative measures only apply if every element is met, every element being routine, repetitive, and integral. Okay. When we look at these requirements, right, and we say, okay, maybe we could use alternative measures, and we can rely on trap key system or a safety mat, right, a guard or interlock, where we have full control of this machine. We also have to take into account the scenario when where there's full body access, right? If I go into this area where there's full body access, I'm behind a part of the machine, and you can't see me. Right? Someone walking by, close the guard door, start the machine. Right? We have to take that into account. Full body access, no full line of sight. Well, we don't have full control anymore. So we either have to add additional control measures and again justify that, or we say, yeah, no, we have to go into lockout tagout. Okay. Where are we at on time? I can run through these really quickly, I think, and I see if I can get to some of the questions. I see some questions coming in, which is perfect. Alternative measures. So situations where alternative measures may imply when lockout tagout is not feasible or practical. Okay, where we need to again do a threading on the machine, where we need power on that machine, or we're doing some form of troubleshooting where we need to see the machine run. Okay, maybe we have to add in additional control measures, enable device, right, a handheld enable device. So again, we have full control of that machine where we can cycle it. All right, but we're not going to go into a lockout tagout. Right, we've did a risk assessment, and based off this risk assessment, the hazard there is acceptable. The risk is acceptable. Right, so it's a bump or a bruise. It's a slow moving part of the machine. This is a risk that we are going to say is acceptable. Okay, or going into a lockout tagout state isn't going to do anything. Okay, it's a thermal hazard, right? We could lock it out, but that thermal hazard still going to be there, right? Or a situation where if we lock it out, we are going to create an additional hazard. Okay, that can be a situation too. When you get into any type of machine guarding or control measure, um, anything that you add as a control measure should not create an additional hazard. Sometimes locking out a machine can cause an additional hazard. And so we have to look into those different aspects as well. Okay. The alternative methods shall be designed by a qualified person. Okay. This I can probably skip, right? So again, some things that may fall under alternative measures. Again, not limited to. We mentioned already die change and clearance amplification, right? So kind of skip this one. The note here that I do want to mention is placing a machine in manual mode in itself shall not be used as an alternative method for lockout tagout. So, okay, you can put the machine in a manual mode. That's fine, but that's not going to say, okay, we don't need to go into lockout tagout because this is a manual mode operation. Okay, that's a great step, a great benefit, but that itself isn't enough to justify that we're not going to lockout tagout. Quick summary: lockout tagout is a legal obligation reserved for tasks which are not routine, repetitive, or integral to the operation. The purpose is to prevent the release of hazardous energy. Companies must define and document the correct personnel, machine tasks, and means to perform LOTO. Okay, procedures must be in place for group and shift change if it applies to your site, of course. Must provide the devices to the authorized personnel. Training must be reviewed annually, including the evaluation of the authorized personnel. Alternative lockout tagout is accepted by OSHA. It just has to be justified and documented. And then some tools to help you understand and guide you through this process is the lockout tagout compliance directive that you can get directly from the .gov website, and also interpretation letters. Okay, I have the links here in the PowerPoint. we will share the presentation, so don't have to worry about writing those down. Um, I am at the hour mark. Let me see if you have time. Let me answer one question. I apologize for the time. I'll just start from the top to see if there's any questions that were not answered in the presentation. I already mentioned the proof of that. Can I get one question? The use of alternative lockout tagout seem the use of alternative lockout tagout seems subjective. How can I ensure compliance uh, to the OSHA requirements when deciding to use alternative measures? Um, so it's important. So yes, it can be subjective, right? If I need to use alternative measures or not, right? Going back to the servicing and minor servicing and whatnot. But that's why we need to do that risk assessment. Right? We have to do the risk assessment to provide that justification. It's also important to remember that the OSHA lockout tagout standard is considered a performance standard, right? So that means that yeah, OSHA establishes general obligations to the employer, but it does leave some leeway to develop and implement, specific methods to meet those legal obligations. And again, going back to ANSI Z2441, that does provide some guidance on meeting those obligations, which goes back to again the risk assessments. Um, I'm over the hour. Definitely wanted to answer that a question. Again, for the questions that I did not answer that were not answered in the PowerPoint, I will reach out to you directly to answer those questions. Um, you do have some downloadable content, some information from what we offer as a service, and again, the PowerPoint will be able to download in the PDF. I truly do thank you for your time and the questions. Again, I apologize I could not get to all your questions, but I will get to you in email. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And I hope this was helpful for you and try to understand those interpretations from OSHA. Stay safe, everyone. Take care.